All right, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Simon, your host from our podcast, The Paladin Podcast. And this is my co-host, Taz.
Welcome, everybody who's listening.
Yeah, hey, guys, sorry for the delay on this podcast. We've had quite a few life events that have occurred to kind of interrupt this podcast. And one of those events was planned by myself. It was the replacement of our Scarlett Focusrite with a larger unit. That's the preamp for a larger unit that can take now 4 condenser mics as opposed to 2. And a further delay was in that getting shipped to us, and then we changed some staff here, as well as we're coming out of COVID lockdown. So a lot of things kind of have pushed us back, but we are going to go ahead and record today our segment 3 of the Easter special regarding the report that we've been talking about, and this is going to focus on the education piece. And so Taz is going to walk us through the education piece and give us a little insight onto some of the disparities and other things that we're going to see in there, as well as talk about systemic racism, the potentials for it, whether it exists according to this report, and some other interesting things. So before we get to that, I'd like to ask you, Taz, what have you been up to, man? How's life been treating you?
It's been pretty good.
Yeah?
Yeah. Well, the main thing is, it's been good apart from the Bitcoin hit.
The Bitcoin, why is that? Tell me about that.
It's kind of,
I mean, I'm familiar with the Bitcoin hit, but were you in?
Yeah, I was in, and then you obviously never know where the top is, but, you know.
Right.
That's the risk you take. You know, you're not going to get 20-30% gains over like a month. And, you know, it's not...
Well, I'll say this, you know, for all those Bitcoin enthusiasts out there, you know, we're going to do a segment on Bitcoin. I think digital cryptocurrency is a very interesting thing. You know, there are a lot of concerns for me. I am and was an investor in cryptocurrency, many different altcoins as well. You know, but I do want to kind of bring to bear the full force of information and background on Bitcoin, especially one day. So that'll be a segment that we do. But yeah, Bitcoin right now is going through kind of a retest of some previous support areas, and I think that's pretty normal with any investment. You know, if you're a day trader, swing trader, you're just a long-term hodler, I think you'll understand what all that means. But basically, yes, cryptocurrency has been long overdue for a correction.
Yeah, and I think if you're wanting to just hodl for a long period of time, that's probably the safest way to do it.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
With the volatility it has.
If you're a long-term hodler, you believe in the idea, you're going to be patient.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, don't worry too much about that. What else is going on interesting in your life? Anything else?
No, not really too many things more interesting than that, apart from, you know, getting out of lockdown, finally getting out.
That's nice, isn't it? Have you had your first pub beer yet?
I went out with a few friends
nice.
Last week, so that was good.
Excellent. I have not been out anywhere yet, so if anybody in podcast land is listening and you want to take me out to a pub for a beer, I will gladly join you. I don't have many friends in London.
They still have some weird restrictions where, like, everything's almost normal, but you can't, like, when you're getting up to go toilet, you have to wear your mask.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, you can talk within your group, but as soon as you get up and go to the toilet, they're like, oh, wear your mask.
I have an exemption because of a disability, but I feel the pain of anybody doing that. That seems quite absurd if you've got to just go from your table to the bathroom, you know, and wear your mask. I mean,
I'm one of these
I think as a scientist myself who's studying the history and philosophy of science, I think that is pretty absurd, you know, when you think about airflow, and you think about you know, particles, especially fundamental particles, how they form molecules, and you know how molecules, you know, form proteins, and on and on and on, and how those are carried by air and everything else, as far as what's being touched, and you know, people sneezing, touching glasses, touching tables. At that point, I feel like it's Mox Nix. You know, if you're in a pub and you're drinking, wearing a mask on your way to the bathroom does absolutely zero for anybody. Do you agree?
Yeah, but I think, look, it's the rules, and it's not kind of... I got to respect their rules if I'm going to their place.
No,
so
hey, look.
If it's an accident.
Free market economy, baby. We talk about this. You and I talk about this all the time, right? Free market economies being what they are. Yeah. You know, if you have a pub and you're the owner, you have the right to serve, in my opinion, XYZ people following XYZ rules. And if you don't like it,
go next door.
Yeah, I mean, and that applies for situations, I think, like pubs and other things. I don't think where that should apply is is monopolies like Facebook or Twitter, where they censor people and they say, hey, look, we only want X customers speaking, not Y customers speaking. And here's why. Those are clearly monopolies, okay? Like, you clearly are unable to, and we'll do a segment on that. We're not going to get too far into that, but you're clearly unable to fight in that sense of the world against something so large. But in London, there's 1,000 pubs. Yeah. So you have your choice, right?
But even away from the monopoly, I think the platforms are a different thing, because the distinction between a platform and a publisher is kind of
absolutely
blurred,
and that's another thing we're going to do.
Yeah, we'll do that.
This is another pin in it that we're going to do an episode on, so we don't want to get in the weeds in that, but I have a couple of interesting announcements. One, I am almost done with my first year at UCL, so I'm happy about that. Things are going very nicely. I will also be returning home to visit family this summer.
Nice.
And I'm happy to finally be continuing these episodes. So without further ado, why don't we jump into it? What do you say?
Yeah, sure. We're going to take a look at the education system and whether it has the biases in it that we've been talking about. The first thing we're going to say is a lot of the things we would say would overlap with the previous episodes. We'll try and limit that, so we are going to kind of summarize what we did say. So that being said, there will be some overlap, but we'll try to limit it, and we'll try to highlight the key findings. Obviously, we're not going to go through it all, but we're just trying to kind of find the significant areas and discuss them. So education, before we start, is the single most emphatic success story of the British ethnic minority experience.
Really? Well, that's interesting.
Well, that's what it says.
Oh, the report says that. Okay.
I'm not giving my value judgment.
Give me some air quotes next time when you.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So it's like over the last 50 years, new arrivals to Britain have seized opportunities afforded by the state school system and access to university. What this is saying is people have, in general, if we zoom out and look back at things, people have come here to, I wouldn't say take advantage, but enjoy the education that's allowed to us in this country at levels from university all the way to primary school.
Right, so and that's important because, a UCL student I was trying to get a hold of, she's from Afghanistan, UCL student, and I was trying to get a hold of her for an interview, but, she hasn't responded. Maybe we're not popular enough yet. We'll get there. In any case, and she had commented to me about her educational experience in Afghanistan, and had told me that basically, as a woman, she was not allowed to have education. And if caught, it could result in her, being persecuted to the point of death. Which I thought,
it's crazy.
It makes sense why people would want to come here for education, because it's. The range of education is virtually unlimited.
Yeah. And the good thing about it is I'm big on, I think most people should be big on equal opportunity. I think women, minorities, anybody should have the opportunity to educate themselves, and that's allowed ourselves here, bless you. But that's a different story from equality of outcome, right?
Right.
So, which is kind of what we're going to look into as well and discuss.
It's one of the big things what we're talking about here is, remember, and I think we touched on this slightly before, is it's not about the equality of outcome. We're not concerned with that, right? We're concerned with the equality of opportunity. Because outcomes are always going to be disparate, okay? And disparate literally means there's going to be a difference. It's not going to be equal. To assume that it could be equal or should be equal for everyone, I mean, that's absurd. I don't want to live in that world where no matter what you do, if you put in 1 ounce of effort versus 20 ounce of effort, it doesn't matter. The outcome is always the same. That makes, there's no incentive to put in any effort at all, or hardly at all, if the output's always going to be the same. So equality of opportunity is what we're focused on.
Exactly. Right? And not only that, you have people who have different skills, which kind of makes life enjoyable.
Right.
I mean, the fact that some
spice
people,
of life is what? Variety.
Yeah, variety. Yeah. So some people, they may not be interested in pursuing a career in X, and other people will be pursuing a career in Y, and that's the reason why we can watch amazing sports, and then we can have amazing chefs, because some people are specialized in one thing and some people are specialized in others, and to assume that among the sexes and the races those traits will be equally distributed is kind of a false start. But
right. I mean, absolutely. Okay, so digging into this report, what is it you're finding?
Well, we're finding, to summarize, that there is no bias from what we can see where white British people are outperforming any other ethnic group. In most cases, it's to the contrary. They're somewhere in the middle of the pack.
Right. So we're going to get into this, and
Yeah.
so what we're seeing is that the narrative that is systemically racist for white people and their outcomes is in question right here, right now.
And
this report is backing that statement. In essence.
Exactly. And to just reiterate the point, where the BAME acronym is unhelpful because Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. We want to break that down further, and they perform differently as well.
Right.
So the BAME, because we've said this before.
Because there's a lot of different subcategories, right, that we're talking about when it comes to race, and to just lump all of these together, it's not useful because why?
Well, I mean,
it seems like it honestly pits.
Yeah.
It seems like it pits blacks, Asians, and minority ethnicities, which is pretty much everyone other than white, against white, and so. That dichotomy of just everyone else against looking at white, it doesn't seem to be very helpful.
No, and it also assumes that, I mean, you could argue it also lumps together people who are totally different in their kind of characteristics, behaviors, that kind of different attainments. So from what we can see in the data, they have got different levels of X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Attainment, for example.
It seems to almost assume that the problem is between black, Asians, minority ethnicities, and white.
Yeah.
When, in fact, when we go through this report together, you see, like you said, white is kind of in the middle of the pack. British white and other types of mixed white are really in the middle of the pack. And there are disparities between them and certain ethnicities, but there's even greater disparities between Asians, specifically the Chinese and Indian ethnic groups, which outperform the white British group by wide margins. And that's directly coming from the report. In fact, quite substantially more than there is a disparity between whites and any other classification.
Exactly. And the other interesting thing this actually good report breaks down is it doesn't just break it down by race, it breaks it down by socioeconomic status, it breaks it down by a few other metrics which are really important, because you want to be comparing apples to apples, rather than
well, because if you have a group, an ethnicity that is economically is a background economically that's suppressed for whatever reason, whether it was purposefully or inherently from coming from a poor country,
culture,
whatever, exactly. Then you want to measure, because it's not fair to measure one group that has socioeconomic status that's been lower against another group that's been higher, and say that it's systemically racist or that it's biased. Well, there are such a things as different socioeconomic statuses worldwide.
Also what we also want to do is, when you said we want to break down everything into more granular level, we want to be making less broad statements. So I mean, for example, if you want to say humans are X, I mean, that's pretty good. It's a huge generalization, but if we want to break it down further and further and further, we want to get closer and closer to the individual, and that's where we can see.
That's where it becomes more useful.
Yeah. So I mean, even categorizing people on the lines of Indian, I don't really like, because even within Indian, you have different socio-economic groups. Also, you have different. Each individual for me is different.
Right.
India
is a big country.
It's got 1 million people.
Yeah. So to classify Indian is like, wow, man, that misses a lot of the differences, as well as, I mean, just from a religious standpoint, you have how many religions? I think.
They have the oldest religions in Hinduism.
Right, but I mean, the breakdown is incredible.
Yeah,
it's large,
people,
and then you've got the socioeconomic status. It's like you break that down, and it's even more incredible. You've got all these different segments.
Yeah.
So it's impossible to just say, hey, Indians as a whole, just like it's impossible to say whites as a whole or blacks as a whole.
And the other point on that is, which I would like to get to, is I think that when you do that, if you had 3 people in a group, I was with 2 other people who happened to share my skin color, if they were doing phenomenally well but I was being mistreated, I would still feel unhappy. My success is not levied on that. It's in no way correlated. It's not really related, in my opinion, right? So it's the individual that gets to where they should get, has the equal opportunity.
So why don't you lead us through this then?
Yeah.
And then we'll just get through this. Tell me about Tell me about what you have found interesting mostly in this report.
Yeah, so we've kind of summarized it, but we're going to a few other bits of detail. It says we're going to actually go through a few graphs, but here it says a higher percentage, for example, of ethnic minority young people attend universities compared with white British people, but they later have a better performing outcomes at university.
Okay, so the latter being the white British young people have a better outcome at the university.
And even this is really
even though there's a higher percentage of ethnic minority young people going. Explain why are we getting that result?
Okay, so this is probably one of the only places where you see white British people doing the best, and I think there's a good mathematical reason for this.
Right, but when you say the best, all we're really talking about is that
the
better outcomes at the universities, right?
Not best overall, but
and at top universities. Even.
No.
So we've got universities, we got top universities, and then we've got those white British young people having better outcomes just at those top universities, right?
Yeah, and even then, it's there's a lot of factors. So I think the main reason for that is a selection bias. I think because less of the white population are going to university or are selected to universities, possibly because of quotas. We'll put it this way, arguably, the evidence would suggest that they have a higher kind of bar to jump over, so once they've jumped over that bar, they have a kind of that's what we call a selection bias, but it could be slightly better. Okay. But let's go into the first few graphs. Should we go to the first one? Yeah, so this breaks it down by percentage of pupils and their attainment goals in early years, so key stage 2, GCSEs, and A-levels by ethnicity.
Okay, before we get into that, because we have USA listeners, coming from the educator background, I'm going to need you to kind of break this down for us.
Yeah.
Us simpleton Americans, and how, when you say key stage 2, GCSEs, and A levels, to me, I'm like, okay, I have no frame of reference for that.
Okay, I've got you. So we start school at reception,
right,
and that's like 4 to 5 years old. You then go through your primary school, which is from. You're about 11 years old, year 6 when you leave that.
Right.
So you go from reception, year 1 to year 6. So you spend about 6 to 7 years in primary education. You then go to secondary education, and you then and you're about 12. You then at 16 sit your GCSE. Some people would be 15, but most people would be 16 because it's at the end of year 11.
Okay.
And then nowadays, after that, people have to go into another field, which we didn't have a couple of years ago, but that's a small nuance. So now you have to do further education till you're 18, but most people would
at 16 would have taken a job, basically.
Yeah, but historically, they could have taken a job.
Now they're going to get 2 more years of like technical training and then go into a job.
Yeah, but for this analysis, it's looking at A levels. So people who take A levels usually follow the academic route. So they're usually people who want to get into universities.
How old are they at that point? A
levels are 18.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So GCSE is graduating like anywhere like 16, and then A levels is 18.
18.
Okay,
Yeah, usually give or take 1 year, people can
resit. The smarter, more high achieving, maybe not even smarter, maybe just more higher achieving, right?
Like, it's funny you should say that. We don't get as much as that from what I've seen in movies as USA. So you don't get often people getting pushed up. Not too often. But I think they can do it privately. You can sit your exams, but usually people stay in school.
Okay.
When I say some people do resit years for extenuating circumstances or illnesses. So
all right. So we're looking at this graph. It's figure 1. We're going to look at this on the screen here and provide this for you as well. Figure 1, percentage of pupils meeting attainment goals in early years. GCSEs, A levels. All right. So right now I'm looking at this graph and I see met expected standard age 4 to 5, met expected standard age 10 to 11, strong pass in GCSE, which is at 16, and that's in English and math, and then achieved at least 3 A grades at A level, and that's the final stage. And what I am seeing right away is Chinese and Indian and Asian, Chinese, Indian, Asian, and even mixed white Asian are leading the top of the graph. Like they are 4 to 5, they're at the top. 10 to 11, they're at the top. Strong pass in GCSEs, they're at the top. as well as even achieved at least 3 A grades at A level. They're at the top.
Yeah, so I'll break a few of those down.
And again, since we talked about this BME, BAME, BAME,
you could straight away see
what is, we don't really know, like Indian, what all is being included. I mean, again, it would be
water.
helpful to get rid of that and break it down even further.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll quickly go through this. So you could see at 4 to 5, there is kind of, it's a bit more varied. You get kind of a small kind of variation, but everybody's is not as clear.
Everybody's neck and neck, pretty much, right?
But
is what we're saying.
As you kind of get older,
right,
you can see that at by GCSE level, there seems to be some sort of like a distribution or some sort of hierarchy where you could clearly see there are some people performing better than others by race.
From what we're seeing, this is the distribution of this report. Chinese, Indian, Asian, and mixed white pretty much stayed dominant. They're neck and neck, age 4 to 5. They stay dominant all the way until A levels. Everybody else just kind of slowly slopes off.
Yeah.
Right? So Bangladeshi, mixed other, black African, white British, mixed white, Pakistani, black other, mixed white black, Caribbean, black Caribbean, Irish traveler, Gypsy, Roma. Everybody else just kind of slope off right there. And so I wonder how much of that is cultural, like I wonder how much of that is as you're raised,
valuing education.
Yeah, value in education.
I even think this study does break that down. I think they mentioned at some point the amount of tutoring people get or hours spent out of education. I'm not too sure if I've read that elsewhere.
Well, I know that we had a report. Roddy, back when he was with us, showed us a graph of like the hours spent of homework on Asian kids versus other kids in the United States. It was quite a dated study, but nonetheless, it was interesting. There was definitely a dominance in the Asian category of how much time they spent on their homework.
Yeah,
it was significantly higher than any other.
I would just play devil's advocate as I always do. You could argue people are more likely to spend time on things they're doing well on.
Right.
So maybe it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario.
Right.
But that being said,
I think it's systemic racism for white people, especially in the UK, is pretty much blown apart with this narrative right here, because you see that even, white other falls off, white British falls off, white Irish even falls off. The only thing that doesn't really fall off too much is mixed white with Asian.
Yeah.
So, but as far as it's systemically racist to keep white people at the top and other people suppressed, that's just completely untrue according to the data.
Can I just also kind of clarify what that means? So, achieved at least 3 A grades at A level. So so to give an idea of the numbers, that A stars are the top grade you can get at A level. So at A level at 18, you specialize and you take 3 to 4 subjects usually, and then you go into university. So looking at this, Chinese get at least 3 A levels. They're achieving that at rates of well above 20%.
Well,
I would say about
so
25%.
23% to 25% of them are getting at least 3 A grades.
Yeah, so that's
a quarter of the entire Chinese population.
So that would get you entry into most top universities, and some of the top courses would want a couple of A stars, and but it will get you entry to most universities.
The next closest one is Indian,
and they
are just under 20%.
Yeah. So it's not a small difference. So just to give an idea of people of the numbers, this graph isn't like that's quite a lot of variation. Right.
And so where are we when it comes to white British? White British are looks 11%. Like they're at 11%.
Yeah.
Right.
So we're not talking about 20.3 and 20.1, and it's been high.
Right. And obviously below white British we have black African, Pakistani, black other, black Caribbean, black mixed white, black Caribbean, Irish, and the Gypsy Roma. Okay. So, but again, middle of the pack, right? So this idea that education is systemically racist for white people and suppresses black people, it doesn't appear to be true. Like, there are definitely disparate outcomes, but let's try and dive further, as this report has, and see exactly why those disparate outcomes exist.
Yeah, so this figure too looks at the percentage of pupils meeting attainment goals in early years, key stage 2, A levels, and degree by ethnicity. Exactly what we've already said earlier. In fact, we touched on this, and this is the only point which we've already mentioned where I think you could see that the achieving at least a 2-1 at undergraduate level at university, you have white people at 81.4%, whereas Asian, which hasn't been categorized into Chinese, which would have been more interesting.
Okay, so
we've discussed those.
What is this exactly saying right here? This is this is the BAME measurement, right? So when we look at it from a BAME level, this is what we're getting.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing when we look at it from a BAME level, right? It's completely different than what the other figures showed, is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Right? Because on this graph we see black, Asian, then the mixed ethnicities, and then we see the white. And now when we look at this distribution, it definitely looks like white is doing better. Right?
Yeah, so it hasn't really broke exactly the point
Right.
you were making. So the BAME is not very useful because if we look at these data points, unlike the previous one,
Right.
you can kind of come to differing conclusions when you use broader brushes,
Right.
which is less accuracy, which is mathematically less accurate.
Absolutely.
You
And
can
we're
kind of
using a
get
very
there.
broad brush with BAME, which
Exactly.
is why you look at this achieved at least a 2.1 at undergraduate level and you're like, wow, you're blown away.
Yeah.
Right? And that's probably because the Asian and the Chinese
have been
grouped
amalgamated
together, right, as
Yeah.
well as all the other.
Now,
okay.
I mean, we could look at the
And it's not
at
really
least-
fair to make the mixed. You're introducing the mix with the Gypsy, Roma, Irish traveler. You know, right there, it's like those are at the extreme poles, right?
Mhm.
So that would highly skew the distribution. Okay.
Exactly.
Makes sense. All right.
Yeah, exactly. The next point we're going to go on to is about the early years and primary education. If I'm not mistaken, the report highlights that students from a disadvantaged background, free school meals, already start school at 4 to 5, at a few kind of behind in their education, and this
Right.
widens as they get older. So, I mean, it's important to get the early years of education right, it would
Right.
suggest.
Okay.
So it looks at all the factors, which is really interesting. So early years in primary school provide a foundation for the rest of a child's career. On average, 40% of the overall development gap between disadvantaged 16-year-olds using eligibility for free school meals. So when people are eligible for free school meals, so they don't have the kind of a good financial background, they're allowed
Right.
free school meals at school.
Uh-huh.
So if we're taking that as a measure, then you can kind of see disparate outcomes just by
Okay,
using
so
that.
what we're seeing is disparate outcomes based on what?
Basically,
Financial background, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So another
right.
way
so
to
so
break
but
it down.
this ties back into our important message, which is that the disparate outcomes aren't necessarily systemic racism, where it's purposely a system built to make one category person fail. What we're saying, what you and I are arguing, what many other people argue, is that that's a secondary indicator, your race. Okay, the primary indicator is your education level, your socioeconomic background, your financial status, basically, as well as your family status. And again, this isn't just do you have a mother and father, but do you have a good family? Like, is a family that's teaching you morals and values, how to work hard, how to ask the right questions? And we're not saying that having two parents, or even the nuclear family having a mom and a dad, is what's going to make you successful in life. Okay, if you have two bad parents that beat you, obviously that's not helpful. Mm-hmm. Versus one parent who's constantly in contact with you and helping you, that is helpful. Okay, but it all boils down to amount of time given to the child and how much that time is good quality time in teaching, training, values, morals, etc. Mm-hmm. So again, primary factors: education, financial status, family status. Okay. We're seeing right here, proof is in this report, that people that have a lower financial status are struggling in education.
And it says it there quite nicely, and it says loving, nurturing, so 5 essential measures of a supportive family environment. And I think these things are brilliant because they would benefit black, white. It doesn't pit people together. It improves everybody, and we can raise the floor of everybody. I think if all children have loving, nurturing
raising
relationships,
tide raises all boats.
exactly.
Right?
So a loving, nurturing relationship with parents and carers, a safe home free from stress and adversity, the right to develop good language and other cognitive skills, support to manage behavior and regulate emotions, good physical and mental health, access to healthcare.
It's about impossible to have the ability to focus on your studies when you have to be focused on your survival. Okay.
Yeah.
If you can't make the monthly payments, if you're a kid who's constantly under stress because the family is disrupted, financially, you're moving around, like whatever it is, it's very difficult for you to focus on something like education.
Yeah.
Because you're struggling to survive. And education is really kind of an element of being able to thrive. It's necessary to thrive, to have education. It's necessary to thrive. But it's not necessarily necessary to survive. And if you're in a survival situation, your first needs are, water, food, shelter.
Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Education's not on that.
As good as education is, the way you can get out of it, but in the short term, when you're young and you have that kind of bias for the short term, you want food and maybe you have other pleasures. And
I can see where this would feed into, the other classes where education might not be important for them because they might be moving around a lot or have to support the family, and so they're they're interested in education until they get to a certain age, and now they need to refocus on providing for the family or working to be productive.
Or alternative, they may also be looking sadly for attention that they're not getting from home because they may have some form of neglect, and if they haven't got the actual parental love and care, sometimes they seek attention, and
they seek other things maybe than education and doing good in education, and that makes sense. So and I think we should all promote that. So the idea of they want to invest in family hubs and providing services to improve family structure, which I think is a great thing, but we don't want to take away the incentive and the responsibility from parents to parent well, essentially. So that's another talking point. We could put a pin in that, but I think you want to promote good incentives by not necessarily giving people money for kind of not taking full responsibility for the kids. We don't want to enable that by just giving them money. The purpose in talking about the socioeconomic factors is we're not trying to explain things away, all right?
No, exactly.
But we do want to understand the root causes of things, right? And so maybe there is a point where funding does have to be injected into the system. I think you actually covered that, right? There was a part in this report, I believe, where it talked about funding being injected, but it wasn't in the right way, or it wasn't being utilized appropriately.
Yeah,
or,
I think because we mainly cover the just looking into it, we didn't cover in great detail when I was reading it about the interventions. But I kind of agree with that approach of, spending money is good, but how you spend money is probably more important, right? Obviously, if you throw money at people for kind of having worse outcomes, maybe you're incentivizing worse outcomes in a perverse kind of way.
Right.
But should we move on to? Yeah. So, in this point, is talking about understanding disparities, and it talks about the immigrant paradigm, and it suggests that recent immigrants devote themselves more to education than the native population because they lack financial capital and see education as a way out of poverty. So it's an interesting point.
That's coming from Professor Steve Strand, University of Oxford.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know the studies about that, but I understand, I understand the mentality behind that. Look, if you, and we talked about this with Roddy back when he was with us, when you escape a regime like communist China, you're not going to a new place to be destructive or to not utilize every advantage of that new opportunity. You're going to exploit that opportunity, right? You're going to take full advantage. And so what this statement is talking about, and what the report does when they look into this, and they look at the history of Black Caribbean peoples, second and third generation, and then they look at new, freshly arrived immigrants that are first generation. It shows us a big change in the people that are second and third generation. Specifically, Black Caribbean is what they looked at. And this tapering off that we talked about, as opposed to the first immigration or first generations of immigrants, and they're staying strong and resilient, being the Chinese and the Indian, because again, they're fresh to the country, they're exploiting that opportunity, and they're staying strong with their desire, right? Whereas once you become established, and we see this in everyday life, once you become established, you're in a job, you're comfortable, generally output tends to decline. It doesn't always drop off completely, but usually it settles or comes to a homeostasis point. Maybe it even drops a little bit and then plateaus, right?
It's like the idea where when things are too good, you don't have that kind of desire, which is kind of an old saying. People, saying, a hungry stomach is
anybody,
like
black, white, or whatever. I think all people want to be comfortable, and they want to have a good life. And when they find that, a lot of us are just happy being there, and we don't, we might not
Strive,
see education as a factor that is necessarily going to improve that, or we might not care. Whereas someone who's running away from a communist regime is, going to be so happy once they get into something that they love, and they're going to put all their effort and energy into it.
More appreciation.
Right. So the report actually says most Black Caribbean and mixed white and Black Caribbean pupils are third generation UK born, while many Black African pupils are more recent immigrants. And so going back to the report, we saw that there was a difference between Black African, right, and the Black Caribbean, and it was substantial. Black African was actually right next to white British when it came to the distribution. As a matter of fact, it's pretty much neck and neck all the way up until at least 3 A grades at A level. So when you go back and look at that, you see that there's a big disparity. Okay, everybody, there's a big disparity between Black African and between Black Caribbean. And so again, what this report is talking about, it says, look, understanding that disparity, a large percentage of these Black Caribbeans and mixed white Black Caribbean pupils are third generation UK, whereas the Black African pupils are more recent immigrants.
Yeah, but again, I want to play devil's advocate. That's not to say that all third generation people don't put it up. But
we're never saying that on this podcast, okay?
No,
I don't like absolutes, but if you ever hear me say, oh, this is absolutely the reason why, no, we can't know that. There's going to be a distribution. We understand that there's going to be a distribution of people, okay? It's going to look like this. Then we're going to have outliers, okay? Outliers, that whisker bar distribution, and the range inside, okay? So we know that it's fair to say that, a lot of this could be explained, or seems to be explained, by this phenomena. And is that a racially disparate outcome? Yes. But, again, that's an outcome that's different based on race.
Not the
but
system.
There are reasons, right, that we know, that we see, that explain that. It's not based on a racist system that is systemically racist or inherently racist that's preventing these people from succeeding, whoever they are. That's the difference here.
And did we have a look at that table above?
Yeah,
so this was an interesting one.
Yeah, lead us through this. This is Table 2, Key Stage 4 Results by Ethnicity, Sex, and Parental Socioeconomic Classification from Professor Strand's submission.
Again, I just want to quickly highlight a couple of things. I think the fact that girls outperform boys. Again, this is the best 8 score, so I'm going to quickly explain what that is. So at the end of Key Stage 4, you sit your GCSEs, and this takes basically your top 6 subjects, roughly speaking. It counts maths as 2, English as 2.
Okay.
And science is already at 2 anyway. So it kind of amalgamates your top subjects.
Okay.
And it sees how you do. And we just see some interesting findings that, again, we have a similar distribution to what we talked about earlier, but we do see females outperform boys. And also, if we break it down by social economic scores, you actually get bigger differences than you do by race. And you see that when you look at the profession, I believe, of the parents, you kind of get the differing outcomes. So if we look here, so we see...
managerial and professional, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, so we have LTU, routine, and semi-routine. What does that mean exactly?
So what
are those classifications?
I think they were looking at the percentage, they were looking at a few factors.
This is what work is, right? Like what profession?
What profession their parents
and
have.
Intermediate is...
I think they broke it down by a few things.
Right.
I think this was looking at the job they do, but they also look at the parental education, the job they do, and family income. So
so they were looking at the family, like the parents, parental, managerial, and professional.
Yeah.
So basically, depending on what your parents do, plays a big factor in how you're scoring, right?
Exactly, and it looked at family.
Wow, so managerial and professional, anyone coming from that has a big advantage.
Yeah, exactly. So also, which... I'm surprised. Well, I think
anyone in the LTU routine and semi-routine, it's a much
bigger disparity than between any of the races.
And that makes sense too if you think about it, because generally those people get paid less, they work harder, longer hours, and so of course, what is that going to play an effect to children?
Exactly.
It almost can't not play an effect, right?
Yeah.
Almost. Whereas the intermediate is pretty much right along the mean right there. So
right.
So what this is talking about, the mean score, right? We're talking about the average or the middle score, and then the deviations off the middle score.
Good. So yeah, as well as those factors, if you break it down by parental education, which is kind of important, you can also see when the parents have no qualification, the average score at GCSEs
deviates.
Deviates. Well, I think that's their mean average score. So basically half a GCSE. It's I think it's minus 0.6 per GCSE.
Okay. So what is that telling us?
I
mean, I understand the median
nice,
factor, but. Yeah. What does 0.6 equate to on a GCSE?
So on your GCSEs, you get graded from 1.
It's like a 2.6 or 3.0.
Yeah. Well,
so if you had a
1 to 9,
right?
We don't go 2 points. We're not American. 1 to 9. We don't do decimals.
So if the mean score say is a 7, then 0.6 off would be
on average
a 6.3.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's. Yeah, I mean, that's still pretty significant.
And I think that's per subject as well.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that means, for example, let's go through this. So
sure.
You get 1 to 9. 9 is like your top mark.
Mm-hmm.
I think people, vary on average. I think 5 to 6 is something on average. But the people with parents with no qualifications, on average, on each of their best 8 topics, they would get 0.6 worse. So
wow,
half a grade on each subject.
Right.
But
I mean, this is not surprising, really, right? Like, if you think about education and the span of education over time, and the access to education, depending on if you're coming from a specific country, like say North Korea, right, versus the United States or the UK, right? It's completely different. Education there versus here. So if you're getting people coming from different countries to one country that has had education going for a long time and has been basically a facilitator and creator of certified knowledge over the ages, then the people that have come from the area that have had that certified knowledge generation over time are generally going to have an advantage if they've partaken in it, okay? And that's what I want to make clear. If they've partaken in that educational system, they're generally going to have an advantage. That's not a systemically racist situation. That's just having been at the source longer and participated in it longer, you're going to have access to things that other people do not have access to.
Well, there's interesting discussions about, there's some books I've read, and it talks about these kind of things, and it says how nowadays people are more likely to kind of seek partners who are similarly educated to them.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
So people are kind of spreading apart.
Right.
So this is, again, it's nothing to do with race. It's saying people with no qualifications, they may not value education. They seek partners who also probably might not be educated. Right. Education oriented.
I look for that in romantic partners. I want you to have education
degree, right?
and not just education, but your education is whatever. It doesn't really matter to me. But your understanding of life and truths in life, needs to be similar to mine. Otherwise, I'm spending all my time educating you on things that you should have already learned, in my opinion.
Oh, you're not going to be compatible, right? I think so.
Well, I think you aren't very compatible if you're at different educational levels, really. But it boils down more to understanding, I think, than education. But education is usually a great indicator of understanding.
There you go. A lot of education, which I want to talk about in my summary as well.
Sure.
Education is kind of like a good signpost for what you can and can't, what level of attainment you've got, even if it might not be very useful in your actual job. But this was just an interesting point to see that, judging by parental education, you get kind of really varying outcomes.
Right. HE below degree to a degree is where, so the standard is AS levels are equivalent. That's pretty much the mean right there. Okay, that's where everybody's coming at the mean. So anybody that goes above A levels,
it's their parents.
Yeah, their parents. Yeah. Okay, that's where it's starting to benefit them as children.
Yeah, so you could argue that maybe they were smarter people, they have smarter children, or they kind of value education more, whatever the reasons are, those are what the data suggests. Also, it correlates very highly to family income.
Which again, we've talked about, right?
Which we've talked about, and we don't want to label you with the same things, but people in the lowest 20% of income differ very almost a whole grade. Yeah, well, basically one grade from people in the highest 20% of the income. Again,
the highest 20% is above par by 0.52.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
So bigger than all of the racial disparities. So
So definitely family status not family status, socioeconomic status, money helps you when it comes to, not necessarily maybe helps you directly, but I would imagine it correlates in situations where your educational opportunities will differ, or better education perhaps.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I think this is a lot of people don't like Trump, and I get that. And this isn't going to be, I'm not going to weigh in and be like, oh, Trump's a better president from the United States. But one thing I did like about him was, he was emphatic about school choice. And why would school choice be important in a free market economy?
So you're the American now. You got to tell me.
I'm telling you is because a lot of schools, when it comes to public schools, they have a range of different, funding levels, and and even if it's funding's not the issue, there is a range of different types of teachers at different types of schools, and so some schools, it's like a business. And some schools will excel based on who the leadership is, their background, their experience, and they will produce better educated students.
Yeah.
So school choice was, a program where he wanted to give people the option of being able to go to school where it's a better school, not necessarily based on where they live. So in America, I don't know if it's the same here. I suspect it is. Mm-hmm. In America, if you're not in a private school, you go to the public school that's within your county or your jurisdiction, whether it's county lines or whether it's municipal lines in the city, whatever it is.
Yeah.
If you live in a certain area, you go to the school that corresponds with that area. So what he wanted to do was propose a situation where it doesn't matter because in America, in a big city, you might live on the line, right here's the line, and you might live right here to the left of this line, to the west of this line, and then there's a school right next to you, literally on the other side of that line. That's a good school. And instead, you have to travel this school all the way over here because it's the one in your municipality or in your county. And it might be a terrible school. And he's like, well, that makes no sense. Why would you want to, because you live in a specific area, why would you want to allow a person who has to now travel farther to a worse school when there's a better school closer by? That makes absolutely no sense. So his idea was to allow parents to choose and get a certain amount of money in that choice to go choose the schools that they wanted to put their kids in.
I think the idea behind that, from our basic understanding, what you've just said, is that there's more competition, and the people who
competition is everything.
The schools that want to do the best, they have to provide the best, as opposed to getting a definite amount in their pocket and then they slack off. Right. But we're focused on England because I don't know the data for that.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how it works in England. I just wanted to put that in there because I think it was interesting. And I think the ability to choose a better performing school, especially if it's closer, it makes sense. It makes sense, and then I think it sets your kids up for success because I would imagine even in England there are some public schools that there are teachers that just really don't care, or maybe they're not good teachers. And this isn't to say anything about England or schools or any of that. I'm sure there are pockets where there are schools that aren't as good as other schools, and there's a variety of reasons for that.
So we get Ofsted inspected here in terms of school, and they rate schools from outstanding to kind of.
So you do, I'm sure, have a distribution of better and worse schools.
Better and worse schools. Yeah, that's a fact.
Right.
So they have a few recommendations in this report as well that we're going to go over, and a lot of them based around fairness and promoting educational success for all communities. It also highlights the fact that geography plays an important factor into how students kind of progress. So let me get into that. In some parts of the country, poorer pupils are over 2 years of education behind their peers by the time they take their GCSEs, so once again at 16, including almost exclusively white places like Blackpool, 26.3 months behind.
Wow.
So close to 2 years.
So that's a white place, like predominantly white.
90s, what was it, 90, I don't know exactly the numbers, but predominantly white.
Right.
And Knowsley, which is over 2 years, so 24.7 months behind, and Plymouth. So again, this is,
we're saying right here, this is another factor where race is, it's not systemically racist per se, but there are disadvantages for these communities as well.
Yeah.
Because they're white and they're poor.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're saying here.
Yeah.
Okay?
So
again,
we should be kind of all people.
Well, right. This is, again, proof towards, socioeconomic status, educational status, and family status, whereas race is a secondary characteristic. Okay?
Yeah.
You can't determine if a person's going to be smart based on whether they're white or black, right? Okay? You can't just look at a group of white people and a group of black people and that's all you look at and say, okay, that one's going to be better educated or more successful. You can't say that. Maybe you could say that when it comes to Chinese, right? Because we've already seen that they have a much higher distribution of successful people in education, and we're going to get to other areas where they're more successful. I'll talk about it as well. But even that would be a stretch, all right? Even to say that would be a stretch. What you can say is that depending on their socioeconomic status, then it's much easier to make a judgment. It's safer, I'd say. I still wouldn't do it, and I don't think anyone should do it because I don't think that's helpful. But you can, if you were to break down, say here's the top percentage of the richest, and here's the top percentage of the most poor. You could successfully bet that these would be less educated and less successful in life versus these would be more educated.
When we say successful in terms of education,
right? In education, right? And we're not talking about
there's many other facets.
No, we're not talking about actual in life as whether you become successful or not.
Yeah.
All right, and so we're back from a quick break there. We're going to continue on. You're going to lead us through a little bit about the reports talking to us here about closing the gap, basically. And when we talk about closing the gap, what they're obviously focused on in this report is closing the gap between any of the disparate outcomes, and that includes the white mixed race, white British, as well as Black Caribbean, and the gaps that those people have with the top forerunners, which is Chinese, Indian, etc.
Yeah, and it also wants to close the gap between those kids who are from lower socioeconomic status, free school meals. So basically, trying to close all gaps to give them equal opportunity.
Right.
I mean, we could argue that will we ever close all the gaps? It's an interesting question that we may never actually achieve all the gaps.
I mean,
close. Is it a futile?
I think we should continue to try. Because it seems like a monumental task, and we can't achieve it in our lifetime, doesn't mean we should give in to that. That's never the case. Small steps towards the goal is what reaches the goal, and over time, one of a person that used to be very close to me gave me a piece of advice that I think I'm going to repeat here. And this person, I used to look up to this person for a long time, and it was a great piece of advice. And it went like this: humans, us as individuals, have the propensity to exaggerate what we can achieve in 1 year and completely discount what we can achieve in 10 years. We think that because we can't achieve it in 1 year that it's not worth achieving, or that we're going to be able to do it, but we completely discount what taking slow, steady steps over 10 years will achieve. And
I think Musk said that. Musk.
Huh? Elon Musk said that?
I think he
so.
might. He might have.
No, Elon Musk. So this was said to me 15 years ago, so that I doubt that Elon Musk was even a person saying things 15 years ago.
I remember. Anyway.
He might have said it's a great piece of advice.
Yeah,
but,
of course. People can say
or
the same,
some variation of it, but this was said to me 15 years ago.
Yeah. So it's trying to make it more kind of fair for all of the groups we've talked about.
As far as the equal quality of opportunity, right.
Exactly.
So the elements of great schools, why don't we talk about that?
Oh yeah, that's kind of pretty obvious. It talks about good leadership and governance, which is kind of self-explanatory.
Yeah, but before we go any further, let's assume that we're talking to the lowest common element, right? Okay? We can't assume that people have common sense.
Okay.
To you and me, this makes sense, right? Good leadership and governance, that makes sense. Good curriculum, that makes sense. Good teaching also makes sense. Good behavior and culture makes sense. Good pastoral support makes sense. High aspiration makes sense. But that's not a given. That's not, it's not something we can just say, oh, it's common sense. Therefore, you should do it. That's the point of this report.
Oh yeah, even if they're common sense, those goals, they're not easy to achieve.
Right,
because you have conflicts of interest.
And you got to put it in black and white and say, here's what is making the difference. And this report is saying unequivocally, these things are making the difference in schools. Good leadership and governance, good curriculum, good teaching, good behavior and culture, good pastoral support, and high aspiration.
Exactly. And they talk through some studies, but...
Right, so they talk through the case study with the Delta Academies Trust. We're not going to really go into details. There's the report, you can read it. But it's definitely interesting to see all the mean scores on the Progress 8 when it comes to, when they measured all of these factors and found that these factors really impact the education. Exactly. So it's something that, that's the whole point of this report, is to say, hey, look, here are the things that matter and are making a difference, and go ahead and follow these and you'll do better. It's not dependent on your race. It's dependent on these factors, and improve these things and you'll do better.
And then this was an interesting point where it said the evidence of the impact of teachers from ethnic minority in the UK is scarce, but studies show that the effects of gender has found that children tend to value teachers, whether men or women, who are consistent and even-handed and supportive of them.
Right. So another thing about the nurturing of children, right, is it's not really, it's not really material whether they're male or female teaching them, so long as they're supportive, right? So long as they're consistent, so long as they're even-handed. That's what makes the difference. Evidence also suggests that there are other important factors that can support and raise the achievement of ethnic minority pupils, such as equipping the school force with high-quality teacher training, investing in a wider school improvement agenda, and the strengthening of core school offering.
Yeah.
Okay, and then this report also talks about how that's tied to funding in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah.
Now, funding is not the only thing, but obviously funding helps when it comes to core teaching, as well as quality of the teacher training, and improvement agendas of the school. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that this report talked about that it was made clear is that there are some circumstances where the funding is not happening correctly, right? That as noted in this report, it's widely documented that socioeconomic status is strongly implicated in low educational achievement. Meaning, if you're poor, it strongly implicates that you'll have low educational achievement. Further evidence also shows that the link between funding and need has weakened in recent years, meaning that funding used to be correlated with wherever there was need, and that has weakened. Okay, so pupils from more affluent backgrounds are attracting larger increases to funding rates compared with those from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And the report says in no uncertain terms, like, look, this needs to stop. Okay. The Commission believes there are too many funding streams that are not sufficiently addressing need. And really, to achieve equality of opportunity, we have to have that, right? If we want people to have equal opportunities, where the need is, so too are the funding needs to be. So, for example, research indicates that groups with the lowest achievement at age 16 are the white British, Black Caribbean, and mixed white and Black Caribbean students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, who are scoring substantially below average for all students. Mm-hmm. So funding and allocation should consider how to best meet the needs of the most disadvantaged, and that includes the white British, Black Caribbean, and mixed white Black Caribbean students. And it's not, and that's kind of a travesty, it really is. And I think this is what you get when you do the BAME category, right? And you lump it all into, you don't get the people who are truly disadvantaged being, it's not targeted enough. So you need to break it down and retarget. And that was an interesting factor that I think needed to be addressed. So anyways, carrying on.
We're going to look at now exclusions.
Okay, what does that mean?
So exactly.
For us Americans
so
out there.
We've got temporary exclusions, and we're looking at, mainly here what we're going to focus on is permanent exclusion. So this is what happened when somebody's in school and they seem to have commit, kind of like a serious offense, let's say.
Oh, okay.
So they get excluded from school. So they get moved to another school.
So is that like an expulsion then? Or?
Yeah.
Is it permanent?
In some cases it's temporary, it's suspension. In some cases it's permanent. Mm-hmm. Permanent means you kind of move to another school, you get another chance, you kind of...
so an exclusion may not be just from all schools, just from that school.
Yeah, and then you could even get excluded to an extent where you go to a PRU, a pupil referral unit, and therefore you have like a kind of restorative course where you're deemed to be like
needing rehabilitation.
Needing rehabilitation, right. And the mainstream don't have the resources to help you.
Right.
So you go to a PRU where you have a higher number of staff to students ratio. You have more of an input, and it's less based around the classroom setting where you kind of...
It's more situational, like to help you specifically tailored to your needs.
Yeah, and
to help bring you back to a level where you can participate again.
Exactly. So the idea is you can then get yourself back to a place where you can be in mainstream and not really kind of stand out or kind of bring everybody down.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. And if you scroll down to this, it says the review found, and we're talking about exclusions here.
Right.
No evidence of systemic or institutional racism, but instead pointed out the complex factors when seeking to explore what drives difference differences in rates of permanent exclusions and suspensions.
Okay, so when it comes to exclusions and suspensions, there's no systemic racism, basically.
Yeah. And if we scroll down, we have disparate outcomes, but that does not necessarily mean, as we've said 100 times over.
Right. So we probably don't need to rehammer that.
The graph.
But talk us through the graph here.
So you have the ratios of people getting excluded, and before you think about other factors, you have those dots. So you can clearly see that, I think, yes, it's the Irish Roma travellers are 5 times more excluded than the white British, which is averaged on, and Black Caribbean are 3 times more. Black and white Caribbean 2.5 times.
Okay, so it says odds ratio of exclusion before controlling for other factors. So what are we talking about there for our audience?
So if you scroll up, it says it quite nicely. It says it here. Right. So a little bit down, For some other children, the analysis finds their likelihood of exclusions remain higher than for white British children. So once we take into consideration other factors, although the association between ethnicity and exclusion is lower than raw rates suggest. So to break that down, what that means is some students, there's about 4 or 5 ethnicities who are excluded at higher rates than white people. But once you consider other factors, it is still more in a few students, but not significantly so. And also you've got many ethnicities who come up below white. So the idea of systemic racism kind of doesn't really suggest that, right? That is to say, other factors associated with exclusion partially explain higher rates of exclusion for some groups.
Right, so these are what we referred to earlier in the report review about known factors, right?
Exactly.
Known contributing factors.
Yeah, exactly. So once you adjust for those factors, you kind of get a distribution which is more similar to each other.
Right.
There is still some disparities where some people are excluded at more higher rates, maybe around 1.8.
And so we're looking at the chart here. We see that when it comes to exclusions, the highest look to be Black Caribbean, any other Black background, Irish, Traveler, Roma, any other mixed background, white and Asian, white and Black Caribbean mix. And those seem to be the highest right there.
Yeah, and then if we were to break this down even further, you see that Bangladesh.
The lowest is the Bangladeshi and the Indian.
Yeah, and they have odds ratios of even below the.
Right. Okay. So I see where that red line is the
white British.
Right. Okay. So that red line is the white British.
Yeah. So that's made at 1.
Okay. Got it. Right there. I see it. Yeah. Okay. And so then you have all these others that when you calculate everything out and attribute the factors, it looks almost similar to that distribution of
attainment, right?
You have the table of the distributions of the disparate outcomes for who's more successful, less successful in education. I mean, it's pretty interesting that you continue to see this theme where quote, white people are in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
And there are people that are more and less.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that...
So that whole idea of it's systemically racist and rigged for white people, again, here is
falling flat.
Yeah, it's falling flat.
But the other interesting thing was that even if you would argue it was systemically racist, I mean... Bear in mind, people are not kicked out of school and not given any funding, and it's not like you kick them out of school and you kind of do with them. They try their rehabilitation.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not like these people are kind of ostracized. They try to give them, at least in good schools.
Right.
But yeah, that was the findings, which I thought was important. Okay. And we've discussed funding.
Right. Exactly. Regarding that funding, I wanted to definitely step back in here and make one thing clear: is this report has done in several locations mentioned things that should be done, and I didn't mention this earlier, but I think that it's important. One of the recommendations is issue funding with clearly defined outcomes and use only proven practices in organizations where there's a track record of success. And this report does a lot of that, talking about good ideas like this. This is one of those things where it's like, look, when you get to schools where things are working and you identify schools that, children are being educated well and being successful, don't reinvent the wheel, like find out what they're doing and replicate that, and there's no reason why you can't replicate that. It should not be an issue. It shouldn't even be something you consider. If a school's doing something well, you're gonna, they're doing it well. Find out what they're doing, and then when it comes to funding, don't just give away money to the most impoverished schools, if they're not, perhaps it's not an issue of funding. Perhaps it's what we talked about earlier, right? With the qualities that make up a good school, and perhaps they're failing at literally everything when it comes to good leadership and governance, good curriculum, good teaching, good behavior and culture. Perhaps they're failing at all of those, and it's not a problem of funding. And so again, the recommendations are to get in there, look and see what's working, find the places that are working, the schools that are working, what's working for them, and fund the ones that are working well, and the ones that aren't working well. If funding plays a factor, then go ahead and do it. But otherwise,
could we just scroll?
Yeah,
exactly. I think to if you just scroll up a bit, because we're going to finish up on a few of these things. To mirror that point, I think it's the same thing. If we zoom out, if an economy, if people are doing well, the good thing is to look at why they're doing well. It may not just be, due to X, Y, and Z racism. It could be due to a number of factors, and therefore it's good to replicate success if you want to have success yourself.
Absolutely.
And then if we go by the progression, so now we're going to talk about progression to university.
Right. So we talked about exclusion. And
we saw
how
white
that
people
looks,
in the
and
middle.
then we see that again we're pretty much in the middle. White people are pretty much in the middle. There's the distribution of less excluded, more excluded, and it's pretty much in keeping with that same trend. Now we're looking at progression rates to higher education. Yeah. And so when they say this, they're meaning the rates of progression by race to university, I would imagine. Right.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, if you were to scroll down actually, and a little bit lower, this graph, I think it's a nice graph, because if we look at figure 4, it says percentage of each ethnic minority entering low, medium, and high tariff providers. So this breaks down universities.
What is that? What is a high tariff providers? Is that like a like a more Ivy League school, so to speak, for the American listeners?
So right. I think what happened
was
more
expensive.
Exactly. We have a flat fee for most universities. It varies a little bit, but that has varied across time. I think the idea before was that you need to get people into. Well, not many people went to university, 50 to 100. I think it was about 70 years ago. A lot few of the population actually went to university.
Right.
And the idea was the more you educate people at higher levels, which I'm thinking we're having some problems with, and I'll try and explain those, you're going to get necessarily better equipped people for the actual future, which is interesting, because what happens is now a lot of people go to...
We have seen that, though. We just saw that in the report where parents, depending on what education level they had, it will show how well they do in school. And so we have tied that education in school helps as far as your jobs and what you're able to do later in life. It's not the sole factor, but it is an important factor.
Yeah.
So...
So my point was that you're always going to have a distribution of people with their intelligence, and just because more people are necessarily going to university, what's kind of happened now, which is almost a perverse effect, is that people have to go to universities, which is kind of a side point. They're now having to kind of do jobs. They're overly skilled for the jobs that they're in. They're having to take...
Okay, so what you're trying to say here, though, is that not every person needs to go to university.
Exactly.
Right? And I would agree with that. Right? Yeah. No, So that's, I think that's a common sense sticking point, but it may not be common sense. Is, look, if you're a person out there figuring out whether I should go to university, I don't know, should you indebt yourself anywhere from 30,000 to, 200,000 British pounds if you're only going to work, at a as a carpenter in construction? No, you probably shouldn't. If you're going to go be a craftsperson, you probably don't need, a 4-year university or 3-year university degree. It's probably not necessary. Yeah. But it's a one-size-shoe-fits-all situation, and we know that doesn't work. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably a lot of people who are going into university, and they realize, this isn't for me. I don't need this, whatever. Which will also, kind of affect these graphs when it comes to who's completing what.
Yeah, and it was just...
And I think that's a problem... Sorry to interrupt real quick.
Yeah.
I think that's one more of the problems of, turning university into this, commercial, profit center idea and constant media bombardment of you need to go to university, you need to get a degree. Well, No.
We could talk about this for a long time because I quite like this topic. I think the problem is it acts as a signal now.
Right.
So because everybody else goes to university,
right.
you almost
I
have
should go to university.
Yeah,
right.
and they get funding just by having the number of people. So courses have opened up, which will not actually benefit you, may not benefit you in the real world.
Right.
You know, there may be majors coming out learning about things which actually in the real world
they're never going to use or
they're
apply.
not going to use.
Look,
right?
it makes no sense to spend so much money on a degree if you get out and you don't use that degree. And sadly, that's what a lot of the younger generation do, exactly that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because I'll be honest, when I was young, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I went in the military, and I went in the military specifically because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I thought to myself, it's foolish to spend that kind of money to not even know what I want to do and just beer pong and, you know, and keg stands the entire 4 years. Like, that makes no sense. So I thought, well, I'll join the military and figure out what I want to do. So yeah, I think that's one of the nuances in education that's always going to be tricky, is to find out who really is going to university and do they need to be going, or should they be going, based off, you know, their desire, their propensity, etc.
And we can talk about that another time because I love to talk about that. And also, this is the kind of one point I wanted to talk about here. It talked about the dropouts. It says once at universities, ethnic minority students, with the exception of Asian students, are more likely to drop out, have a lower attainment levels and lower earnings after graduation, which actually correlates and kind of gives credence to the idea what we were saying earlier. Because less white people are going to university, the bar is necessarily higher, so they're kind of having better. Bear in mind, when you go to universities, nobody knows your race when they're marking your paper. It's all done double blind, so there can't be kind of any bias in terms of
you'd have to be you'd have to be an advanced, like, computer AI system or something to try and gauge based off how the writing is structured, who that person is, as far, because you're not going to see race. What you're going to see is you're going to see educational status, right?
Yeah.
When you're reading a paper and you're grading it, you're going to see how
the quality, right?
Yeah, the quality, right? The education part is going to come through, not the race. You're not going to look at a paper and go be like, I know that's a white person, or I know that that's a Caribbean person.
Actually, that's something we should mention as well. In all levels, well, actually, in GCSE A level and degree level, pupils have center number and numbers written on their papers. They're not.
There's no identifying.
No pictures.
Information.
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I mean, not maybe some universities, but not from what I know.
Right. So this is. I don't think we really talked about this, did we?
No, not really.
Well, let's hammer this out real quick and just get through it.
So this talks about the people.
We were getting to it, but yeah, the people who continue on to
university, basically.
Right, and we see right here again with this trend. This is table 7, progression rates to higher education. We see at the top of the list again the Chinese, top of the list. Also up there are the Indian, top of the list. And you know, we also have Black African, Bangladeshi, any other Asian background, also top of the list.
Can I just say what this was going to show, because it builds on the point that we had just talked about.
Right.
This shows that despite higher attainment, the white British people are going to higher education university at 38%, right?
Right.
So that shows you that they are being, the bar is very high for them compared to almost any other groups now.
Well, there's it looks like a lot less of them are
being selected. Now that could be due to quotas, or I don't know the reasons why, the push for diversity, but you could see that because people are pushing for those things, the rate of Black, African, Bangladeshi, Indian, Chinese, I mean, there's
but there might be a lot of reasons why they're looking to go to higher education, you know, like, again, this might be a thing of like where they see the Black African is mentioned, and we talked about the generational Caribbeans versus Africans. You know, these, when you talk about Chinese, Black African, Bangladeshi, Indian, those being the top, those are also the top. Those are the top percent of incoming, incoming immigrants, right? So of course, when you have, look, if you're who's immigrating to a country and looking to be, you know, looking to throw away their life in a new country, like, that's not why you immigrate. You immigrate for opportunity, and when you go and capture that opportunity, you excel because you're motivated to, right? That was the whole purpose in your immigration. So to me, it's not surprising to see these numbers.
But it would suggest that given that they have differing, that's not particularly in line with the achievement, right? So I think
that's not. Yeah, we're not looking at achievement here. We're just looking at progression rates. Okay, this is just, there's a higher percentage of Chinese, Black African, Bangladeshi, and Indian that are progressing to
and it's
university. But it might also again be one of those cases where white British are just not seeing the value.
I don't know I don't know exactly how many have applied, but what I would say is that it's clearly quite low, right? 37%, whereas some of those others are almost twice as more likely.
Yeah, but there may be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe they just don't feel it's necessary.
Yeah, maybe.
Or maybe they live out in the country somewhere where they're never going to apply, a degree, and now we're talking about a higher. Most of the universities are where? Metropolitan areas, right?
Yeah.
And most of that diversity is where? Metropolitan areas, right? So a large percentage of these, white British might be out in the country where, why am I going to pay for a degree and go far away to get a degree when all I'm going to do is continue managing, this small business of my parents or whatever else. So,
but it was just to show that there's clearly not a selection bias in favor of white people going to university, right?
Yeah.
I was just saying that point because it's clearly not the case for that one.
All right, thanks for staying with us after the break. This is going to be our closing session for the education. I think you have a couple of points you wanted to make before we close this session out, and then we're going to say goodbye for this segment and come back to you in another week with my segment on criminality, which I think a lot of stuff going on there, so that'll be exciting. But yeah, a couple of things that you wanted to talk about real quick before we parted ways.
So I kind of have a few kind of questions about the reasons why people would want to break it down by race, and I think that it may be counterproductive to break it down by race for one, and number two, we fully understand that people differ in their temperaments and their ideas and what they want to do, but there may not be a case where you can necessarily close all the gaps. For example, you may trying to get Chinese people to equalize with all other people, it may actually be you might have to bring down Chinese people as opposed to raise everybody up. So I'm just I'm being critical of the study itself. I'm just trying to, as I said, play devil's advocate and trying to kind of potentially argue. Right,
but I think there's a lot of factors, that go into like the Chinese history that we haven't covered and why they do better. We talked one of the factors we talked about earlier was an old study about homework, and that's also in this report. It also talks about Indians as well as far as the two groups that have performed the most homework 5 days a week. It's the Indians and the Chinese. And they have the highest percentage of kids that do homework every day 5 days a week and do all the homework. And so to me, that's not a surprise when you do the work.
You do
that you get the grade. I mean, this is life in general. This is why I don't like socialism, like the idea of that if one doesn't have, you can take from them and give to someone else. It's like, well, if you're not doing the work, don't expect the outcome. In what situation ever in the world where you don't do the work do you think that you're going to get the reward? That just doesn't, that's not a real thing.
Exactly. But I'm just thinking about on a more individual level, you sometimes see people who they might not be, for example, suited for education, right? And I'm talking about on an individual level. So I think sometimes it's unfair. We can be too critical of them and saying, it's purely down to you. I think for some people, education isn't necessarily for them, and they can do plenty of other stuff. So
or just regimented, years upon years of regimented city. Maybe education is for them and actual experience. Like, look. Education is information, right? It's information encoded, and the idea of that information is that people can utilize education to implement in their everyday lives for their actions to have better outcomes, right? But you can get education from books, right? Or real life experiences. Like there's experiential education, there's university / primary school, whatever, elementary education is what I call it from the United States, right? So there's the learning you get in the institute, and there's the learning you get in the real world.
And I just wanted, exactly. I wanted to say,
and we're not focused on that.
No, exactly.
In this world, you don't get a choice as an individual where your aptitude is measured. Hey, will you be good for institute education, or will you be good for experience education?
Yeah, and exactly, exactly what you said. But I wanted to kind of give a final point as well, just on the fact that those people who are doing well and who have done well, and who individuals who achieve highly, sometimes people can be kind of critical of them, and we shouldn't be looking at people who are overachieving, or even groups of people, as negative, because sometimes they benefit everybody.
Right.
And those are the people who might push the boundaries of science to what we know and kind of help us get to where we are, which is what we have around us. They may invent the things that means we are more productive, and they benefit everybody, so they raise the floor of everybody. Which is just another point about...
Absolutely. Out of all that, the points that I really wanted to make is like, look, we shouldn't hold down, like, say the Chinese and Indians doing really well in education right now. It's absurd to try and formulate a strategy to hold them back to get everybody else so that they're having equal outcomes. Like, that's absurd. It's just as absurd to say that because there's a disparity between black and white that there's systemic racism. Like, that's absurd to say, okay? On its face, it's absurd to say. Okay, if there is systemic racism for whites to make them come out better, then they're doing a very poor job of it, because Asians and Indians are excelling in education, and that's not the only area. You'll see that that theme repeats in other areas of this report. So, let's dispense with the racially charged rhetoric, and let's focus on improvement. And the only way that we can truly improve is when we're honest with the situation. To say that it's to wash it all as it's systemically racist and you can't succeed, then you've already given up. You've already pigeonholed yourself or your race, and you've already explained that, look, it's not possible because it's not fair and it's all rigged.
And I think that mentality doesn't actually help those people.
It definitely doesn't help,
because you want to tell people,
especially not kids, because kids will believe that. You're an adult. If you as an adult say, the reason why you'll never succeed,
because of the color of your
Shantae,
skin,
is because you're a colored person. Well, this report says exactly the opposite. No, it has nothing to do with that, and has everything to do with your education, your socioeconomic status, and your familiar status. Okay, and education is a big one where we even see that again. And what this report wants to focus on is how to close those gaps. And I think that's a fair thing to do, and to want
without pulling people down. I think is a good
idea. Because you never know when the Chinese or the Indians are going to invent the next thing that benefits all of humanity. And you would want to pull them down so that but that makes no sense whatsoever.
That was just a point on that. But the report is quite clear in terms of what you were saying.
Sure. Any other last thoughts?
No, that was basically it.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we've gone through a lot in this report so far. Definitely there was a lot in the education segment. Again, we want to talk about the disparities. Being racial disparities means that based on race, there are different outcomes. It does not indicate specifically that is systemically racist or institutionally racist or otherwise. Okay, we want to hammer that over and over and over. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're using that as justification why you're not succeeding, maybe stop and think about that for a minute. Maybe be honest with your evaluation of yourself. Not to say that there isn't systemic racism in the world. People coming from China experience it. Absolutely. If you're, a Muslim practitioner in China, and and you're one of the Uyghurs.
I don't know much about that.
That's one example of it. Or if you were, African American and black in America, pre 1700, 1600, all the way up until the emancipation. You experience systemic racism, institutional racism.
But now it might be used by people who might not even believe it, but it's actually being counterproductive to the people.
It absolutely is being counterproductive to the outcome that I think everybody wants. Everybody wants everyone else to succeed. And I would challenge anyone that would come to me and be like, no, this institution wants this specific race to fail.
No, that's actually another
interesting point. I challenge it.
I think
say, show me the specific instance where this is true.
I think that's another interesting point. If you come at it from a totally kind of an alien perspective and you come down, it would be to no one's benefit to not educate people and have people not in the workforce and not working for society, because essentially those people who fall into those things, which I'm sure you'll tell us about, crime rates, we end up having to kind of a society pay and rehabilitate them. So there will be no benefit to any society to keep people down.
No, there really isn't.
There's benefit to everybody. The better everybody can do.
To keeping a certain race down, I don't see any benefit to it at all. I personally don't see any benefit to it, and I don't see how any free markets would find benefits to it. No, absolutely.
Definitely not any free markets. They would want people to achieve.
Yeah, the more educated you get, the more experience you have, the better you are at the things that you do.
I guess that's what capitalism
if you sweep a large room once versus 1,000 times, eventually you're going to see that there's a better method to sweep, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to get better, even if it's at sweeping. That's at every single thing you do in life. The more you do it, the better you get. So, yeah, improving people just means a more efficient world all around.
And especially in a free market, you want to employ the best, so the color is relevant. The people who are actually racist get pushed out of the free market because they don't gain as much money because they're being less efficient.
Well, especially if you're going to look, now I'm just giving an example, and this has nothing to do with education, but since we're kind of freewheeling here, like if you're going to be, I'm probably not going to gain any friends in Kentucky for saying this, but if you're going to be a KKK style racist in rural Kentucky and be like, I'll only hire white people because I'm a racist, well, like if you're not going to hire from surrounding areas where there's all kinds of ethnic minorities,
it's who's best at the job.
In those higher density areas. Well, you're missing out on a lot of talent in the talent pool, right? Because again, if you're only going to recruit from rural Kentucky, you're probably recruiting from a poor area, right? Yeah. Socioeconomic status is poor. Education is probably also low, pool. Right? So you're choosing race only, and you're probably going to result in getting yourself less experienced, less educated workers for your workforce. So that it just doesn't make sense. Base your choices on exceptionalism, okay? Who's the merits, who's doing the best, okay? And for the people who aren't doing the best, find out why and see what it takes to improve that. Education is one of the important factors. So hey, we thank you for joining us on this episode. This was part 4, part 3? Part 3. It's been so long, guys, we forget. Part 3.
We're going to label it.
And we're going to label it for you. We're going to post it online. Once again, if you liked our podcast, please share our podcast or follow our podcast. Even if you don't do any of that, we'd love to get some comments from you. So feel free to use the comment section. Tell us what we did good. Tell us what you think we didn't do good. And we will see you next time. So thank you a lot and have a good evening.
Take care.